Well, hello there. Good afternoon and welcome to Business Jam Live. This is Innovation Without Tears. It is I suppose, Keynote Light. It is a shortened version of a keynote, all to do with innovation. So it's the light version. Not everything's in it. It's designed to give everybody a flavour of what's happening. So today I'm using slightly different software for this, so I don't have access to all of the comments and things. So if you do have any comments, questions, feedback even, please leave it in the usual place, either on YouTube, Facebook or LinkedIn, and I will be picking it up at some point, or my details are at the end, so you can give me an email. So, Innovation Without Tears, what's this about? Well, the problem is with innovation is, aside from the fact a lot of people, they don't really have a great idea of what it is, but aside from that, there's the fear factor. It's a big thing. You either try and demolish it all in one go, or you run a mile and don't do anything. Now, there's somewhere in between. I don't believe you should run a mile. I believe you should get to grips with it. But the point is, as I say, there is this fear factor. Now, if you could somehow make it seem less scary, break it up into smaller, more manageable, less risky pieces, then you would have innovation without tears. Well, that's what I'm saying anyway. So, who is Colin, my phantom guest? Well, I think it's about time to introduce him. So, meet Colin. Colin, as you can see, is a chameleon. And I picked Colin because he's a great metaphor to use. But also, chameleons are very, very good at change. And it's one of the things we need to do when we're innovating, is to be able to change. Some people might say, well, chameleons are invisible and that's not what we want. Well, we want to make the changes almost invisibly, almost automatically. But the changes themselves, the changes that make the products and services that really zing for your business, those are the things we really want to see. So I'm suggesting that if we make these a bit more sort of automatic, a bit more easy to do, they will happen almost without thinking. So let's try and give you a flavour of why we might need to do this, and then maybe just a few of the things that you can try to actually get to grips with this. So, this magic number, is 4.39 quintillion. It's the number of litres, plus or minus a few, of seawater in the Mediterranean. Now, many of us have been or will be going to dip our toes in that. So, imagine you're there now. Lovely, idyllic. But somewhere along the beach is a man with a litre container. There's a litre of seawater in it containing bacteria, 1 billion bacteria that double in number every minute. Now, these are pretty unremarkable bacteria, apart from the fact that one of their byproducts, one of their waste products, is a red dye that stains and is very difficult to remove. So, bearing in mind we've got 4.39 quintillion litres, bacteria double in number every minute, how long do you think it would take for the whole of the Med to turn red, and you and everybody else would have to have completely vacated it? How long? Is it hours? Is it minutes? Days, months, years? Never? How long? Well, you've had your guess. The time is actually just short of 62 minutes. It's not very long at all. And I've done this with people, and we've picked the Atlantic, we've picked the Pacific, we've picked the Indian Ocean. And because this is exponential, the time difference is really not that great. So up to about 64 minutes, I think, is the maximum. And here is the crux of it. Many of the things that are happening, many of the changes, many of the things that are affecting us are exponential in some way, shape or form. We've had COVID. That was exponential. Social changes. Think of something like Chinese whispers, something that's spreading throughout society. That is exponential. As far as technology is concerned, we've had Moore's law, where things costs halve and processing power doubles in a very short space of time, approximately 2 years. So lots of things are happening exponentially. They are going to come at us at a great rate of knots. So we need to be ready to change, but also we can actually make use of this factor. Now imagine that we could just categorize companies, or even your company, by say spend on research, and the resources could be materials, people, or money, and over time. So each year you spend a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and your spend will go up something like that. That's incremental change. Now what happens if instead of an extra 10%, you actually multiplied it by something? A bit like, think of the R factor with COVID. Well, your expenditure could go up like that, such that at the end of a period of time there was a gap between those two approaches. And this gap between the two is what we call the exponential gap. So companies that do things like that realise they can maybe spend a bit more or invest a bit more effort over a period of time, can actually leverage that and create a gap. Now, a company that we all know, and I wouldn't say love, but we certainly all know them, is Amazon. Now, back in about 1990, I think it was, their research budget was something like 25 billion euros. Fast forward a year or two, and they were spending an extra 5 billion euros, 30 billion. And at the same time, the entire research and development budget for Italy was 26 billion euros. They were spending more money than Italy on research. Now, what were they doing? They were spending money on all sorts of things, but a lot of it was IT. And until recently, there was a thing called Moore's law, where every 2 years, the number of transistors on an integrated circuit doubled, but the cost halved. So if the cost halves and the capacity doubles over something like 10 years, you actually have a situation where for the same amount of money, you can get 100 times more computing power, or you can buy the same computing power for 1/100th of the cost. And Amazon, I think, took the view that they could spend more and get even more computing power. So that's what they did. Other companies have done similar things. Now, the other thing that goes hand in hand with that is companies have a natural life. There's a natural life cycle, a period for which they will exist. People may very well say, oh no, there's not. I know companies that have been in existence for 50 years or more. Yes, but they haven't existed in the same way. They haven't delivered exactly the same products. What I'm saying here is a company who is doing the same thing, or a product within a company, it has a finite life cycle. Now, the interesting thing is, well, first of all, what we can do and how long these life cycles actually are. Now, Charles Handy came up with this idea of the sigmoid curve, but it was based on a life cycle that looked roughly like that. So a company starts up, it grows, it matures, it declines, and the bit that's missing is death. So we don't want to get there. But the thing to remember is that once you get into the decline phase, you have a 10% chance of getting back to the plateau at the top. Or to put it another way, you have a 90% chance of dying. Now, Charles Handy thought that what we should be doing is trying to stay around that maturity phase. That's the cash cow bit of our business, if you like. That's where we're making the money. We've put all the development effort in. We're reaping the rewards. We don't want to go any further forward. But the trouble is, at some point we will, and we can't help it. So what we need to do, or he said we should do, is spot the growth phase and where it starts to plateau. That's the point we should be taking action. And then what do? We can start up another company, or create another product or another service, and keep cascading upwards. And that sounds a great idea. But how long are these life cycles? How long is it between inception and death? Well, from about, the end of the Industrial Revolution up until the 1980s, the average life cycle of a business was around 75 years. So don't forget, that is from inception to death. So to get to that maturity phase, we are looking at half that, 37, 38 years. And most people, if they joined a company, whether they be employee or senior management, they will not have experienced the death of a company, the competition, the COVID-like incidents. They wouldn't have experienced these. They wouldn't have had to deal with them. They wouldn't have had to anticipate or recover. So what happens if we go further forward in time? Well, up to the 1990s, this is shortened a little bit. So we're looking at about 15 years. So again, half that period is between 7 and 8 years. This isn't exact, but it gives us an idea of the order of magnitude of the timescales that we should be thinking about. What happens if we go up to 2020? It's worrying. Between 6 and 8 years. So businesses, and you might automatically think, oh, these are high-tech businesses. No, these are all businesses. Not simply because of the products or services they sell, but maybe of the tools and equipment they use for manufacturing. They are going to be looking over their shoulder, having to deal with competitors every 3 to 4 years. So this is quite interesting. So how do we deal with it? Well, we need to be good at change. Be a bit more like Colin, I suppose. But there's 3 things we have to do. And the first one is we need to be able to anticipate change. So how do we actually look for these things? How do we scan the horizons, the environment? Well, I can't give you a comprehensive list, but the sorts of things we should be doing are looking for a variety of sources of information, not just looking at the latest trade magazines or industry magazines or whatever, not talking to the same people, not letting the same people suck that information into our businesses. We need a variety of things from a variety of sources and be analysed in a variety of ways. There's many more things that we can do, but I'll point you at some tools later on that might help you. But how do we design change? Do we say, well, this is what we're going to do, or we've done something like that before? We'll just do it again. Or do we actually take a proper, measured approach to actually designing the changes that we want? The worst thing you can do is say, well, we've always done things like that in that particular way, and we know it works. But you're trying to change. This is the point. and then we need to implement it. So if people don't know what's going to happen, if people don't know why it's going to happen, if people aren't prepared, then when you hear cries of, oh, this is painful, then you've done something wrong, or rather, you haven't done anything at all, which is the wrong thing. Now, I've got a very simple tool on my website, which you can have a bit of fun with, which will let you look at these three things, how good you are at anticipating, designing, and implementing change. Please go there. And if you can't find it, just drop us an email. My contact details are at the end. But when we're going to change, who do we need to take with us? Well, this is one of my favourite diagrams. It's actually the innovation adoption curve, but for innovators, you could apply that to people within the company, or you could say, well, it's really just the people who we're trying to get to move to our new products and services. It doesn't really matter. But there you have innovators, a very small percentage of people. These are the people who currently are thinking about how they can get their hands on an iPhone 55, which doesn't even exist, but they want one. Then you have early adopters. These are the people who were looking for the next model, and as soon as it's on sale in the Apple stores, they're going to be queuing outside. They don't care. They want it, but not quite as much as the innovators. Now, the early majority, they're going to wait a little bit. They're going to wait maybe until a month or two after launch. They're going to wait for some reviews. They're going to wait for a couple of software updates to make sure it doesn't break. The late majority, well, they're going to wait till these things are second hand, so that's still a good buy. And these folks are still using their old Nokia 3310s. They're great. You ain't going to move them. So, what's the point of all this? Well, the chasm is roughly, it's not exactly, but it's roughly the place where to the left of that point, those are the people you need to focus on. Those are the customers you need to focus on. Those are the staff you really need to focus on. Maybe a bit of the early majority. But once you've got these people on board, the whole thing flips over. You do not need to spend your energy, your resources, trying to convince 100% of the people. So the question is, there's a lot of ambiguity in this. How on earth do we manage it? I can see people who've been used to dealing with Prince methodology and other sorts of methodologies, which are sort of fairly rigid in their outlook. They're not going to be that keen on this. There is a lot of ambiguity, but here's a strategy, if you like, not quite a project management method, a strategy that you could use, that you could maybe tailor some of your existing tools to work with. So here we are at the start of whatever it is we're going to do, at the start of our change. How about if we don't actually specify the endpoint as, well, when we've got this done or when we've made this amount of profit? How about a range? So we're going to make profit of where we want, plus or minus 10% or plus or minus 15%. We maybe want to get some functionality and we need to exceed a certain amount, but after that, where we get is a little bit in the lap of the gods. So our end point is something we can work towards, but it's not that tightly specified. So how do we work with this? Well, we have limits, and as long as we are within those limits, so our limits could be budget, they could be resources, all of things that you'd normally look at. I don't know, number of errors, maximum number of staff, whatever. As long as we're actually working within, think of it the World Athletics Championships are on at the moment. So think of this maybe throwing a discus or a hammer. As long as you're within those white lines, everything's fine. And we just make progress. We go from the start towards the end. We might tack a little bit, but generally there's forward motion. And regularly during that period, we have reviews to make sure that we are within limits and we're still moving forwards. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will have realised that those green letters actually form a word, and that word is stellar. Now, this is a framework that was created by the Reinvention Society, and it works nicely. You can tailor some of your existing tools to work within it, but it allows us to cope with ambiguity. So very briefly, just to wrap up, if we break things up into smaller bits, we can make the changes we need without all the fear and pain that's normally associated. But we have to do it because these life cycles, they're shortening. We have to take them into account. Competitors are using things that are related to exponential numbers, basically. So we have to take all these things into account. There is a certain amount of ambiguity, but we can actually create planning methods that take that into account. There's plenty more things we can do to assess potential within organisations, so we know where to spend our money. Financing and budgeting, you can be innovative with those as well. But all I'm suggesting is that we break these things up into things that are a little bit more easy to understand. We can put them together and sometimes stitch them together with things that we do already have in our toolboxes. So if we can do that, if we can make these things a bit more second nature, we can be a little bit more Colin. So remember that. Be more Colin. And if you want to ask any questions, Colin doesn't have a social media account, funnily enough, but send me an email. There's my LinkedIn QR code or my contact details. And as I said, there's a questionnaire all about change on my website. If you can't find it, send me a email and I'll point you at it. So, thank you very much for listening. As I said, if there are any comments, questions, feedback, please leave them in all the usual places. So I shall be back, hopefully with a guest, next time. So thank you for listening and stay safe in the heat. Have a great day.